Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, my name is Monica. I like to post anti-MLM life and some true crime content. So if any of that interests you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I would love for you to stick around. In today's video, I am bringing you a true crime case. Just as a disclaimer, of course, as per usual, this is just based on the research that I have done. I do encourage you to do your own research. This is also based on opinions, and I do have to issue a warning because this is probably one of the worst cases that I will be talking about on this channel. Warning: the following presentation is intended for mature audiences. It contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and adult language. Viewer discretion is advised. And again, I have to reiterate, this is one of the worst cases that I have covered, and there is a lot of graphic content in this particular video, so proceed with caution or just click off the video. It might not be the video for you. Today I'm going to be talking about Richard Cottingham. Now, if you don't know who that is, he has a few different names that I found when I was doing my research. One was the New York Ripper, the other one was the Times Square Ripper. Another one even called him the Torso Killer, which is not to be confused with the Torso Killer from Cleveland, which I might look into that case at one point, but anyway, Richard is an American serial killer who operated between the years of 1967 to 1980. And he was known for dismembering his victims. At one point, there were a few victims where he had removed their hands and decapitated them and then lit them on fire. But we will get into that. When I looked into this case, because I was curious because honestly, this is gonna sound really weird for me, especially because I'm so interested in true crime and cases and serial killers and just looking into these things and trying to understand what went wrong, kind of a thing. Basically, when did these serial killers just snap and start killing? So I decided I wanted to look and see if there were any serial killers from my area where I grew up. I grew up in New Jersey for the past 30 some odd years of my life. And I started looking into it, and then I came across this case. And then I thought about it, and I had heard this case before from somewhere, but I couldn't pinpoint where until I remembered that Ready to Glare, she did a video on an article, which I will go over later because I have my own opinions on it as well. But I will leave her video linked below because if you know Ready to Glare, she's really great at, I would say, speaking her mind and speaking her opinion, but I will leave that link below. As per usual, I do like to start off these videos and the cases that I look into, looking into their past and looking into how are they brought up, because me personally, I like to know the psychology behind it. What caused a person to do something like this to another human being? And so I always look into, and I know that a lot of true crime content creators, they also do the same thing. So I think we're all kind of wondering, just like I've said multiple times already, where did it go wrong? Richard was born on November 25th of 1946 in the Bronx, and he was the first of 3 children in his family. And then they would eventually move to New Jersey when he was 12 years old. In 1964, Richard had graduated from Pascack Valley High School in New Jersey. There is a documentary, which I will also leave linked below, and in that documentary, there was a man who was one of his ex-classmates, and he spoke about Richard. He said that he had this very wise guy attitude, and from what he had known, Richard didn't date anybody when they were in high school, but that's just from what he had known. Richard could have easily dated other people, but there was nothing about him that struck people as he's a killer or that he's going to become a killer. The only thing that the classmate did point out is that Richard had this weird, not necessarily dislike for women, but it was just odd to him that he didn't have any girlfriends, but he had this obsession with women's breasts. It was just, he had like this obsession. Now, I understand teenage boys. They have those obsessions. But his classmate said that it was a little bit more than what the average teenage boy would be into, I guess you can say. And then after 1964, when he did graduate, he would go on to work for his father at Metropolitan Life Insurance Company until 1966 as a computer operator. And then after that, he would get a job working at Blue Cross Blue Shield in New York City. He would work at Blue Cross Blue Shield until he was arrested in 1980. On May 3rd, 1970, Richard would go on to marry his wife, Janet. They would get married at a church in Queens. Then they would also have 3 children of their own. Richard's wife would say that he was a really good dad. He was a really good family guy, and she never suspected anything because he was always present with his children, and he never showed any kind of inkling of anything going on. Before Richard would get arrested for killing his victims and the heinous things that he did to those victims, he did get in trouble with law enforcement a little bit. On October 3rd, 1969, he was charged and convicted of driving while intoxicated in New York City and was sentenced to 10 days in jail and a $50 fine. Then, on August 21st, 1972, he was charged and convicted of shoplifting at Stern's department store in Paramus, New Jersey, and was sentenced to pay a fine of $50. Talk about getting off easy. Now, I understand that back then, $50 was a lot more than it is nowadays, but I feel like you're driving while intoxicated. You only get 10 days in jail and a $50 fine. That to me is just insane. That is just, to me, it's insanity. There is an interview that Richard did. If I remember, I'll leave it linked below because I don't remember if I saved it or not, but there was an interview that he did, and during that interview, there's also, the audio recordings are also out there as well, but he would go on to talk about, he claimed that he had 85 to 100 victims. What creeped me out when I heard this audio recording and when I watched the interview, he had a little giggle afterwards, as if he was almost proud that he had so many victims. And there were a few interviews of other investigators that talked about it as well, and there was one, I believe she was a forensic psychologist. She was saying how this is very similar to narcissistic behavior and that this is just what they do. So I'm going to assume, allegedly, in my opinion, that he probably had some kind of narcissistic behavioral traits or some kind of issue with that, always wanted to be in control of a situation, which you'll find out eventually as we go into each victim. But I don't know, just the fact that he sounded proud of himself, it was just very eerie to me. And especially, I don't know, it was just very, very eerie to me. But back then, the way that you see Times Square today, me personally, when I lived up there, I avoided Times Square because it was always jam-packed. Now, I get it. New York City is always packed. I get it. The city is always packed. But Times Square was probably, I avoided it at all costs. But a lot of people know it as a place to go for tourists. A lot of people, if they're visiting the city, they want to go to Times Square. They want to see where the ball drops every New Year's. They want to be able to see all of these things. Now, granted, I have been to Times Square. It is an experience, but I didn't like going there. But back then, during his killing spree, Times Square was not the Times Square that we know and some people love today. Times Square back then was filled with sex workers. It was filled with porn shops. cheap motels that you could take a sex worker to, and it wasn't the same Times Square that we think of today. I did want to mention, because I have covered the Green River Killer before, Gary Ridgway. If you have not seen that video, I'll link it below or up in the cards or something like that. But he also had, his MO was to kill sex workers. And I feel as though, this is just in my opinion, I feel as though for Gary, I mean, obviously he had a dislike for sex workers, and Richard, it seemed like eventually he had an issue with sex workers because one of his coworkers had said at one point that he contracted a sexually transmitted disease from one of these sex workers, which, I mean, it's, and I'm not trying to talk down or anything, but back then they weren't as educated in these things, first of all. Second of all, if you're going to pay for sex, how many times has this woman gotten paid for sex? You're kind of, at that point, you're kind of asking for it. And, you know, I understand that they should be using protection and stuff like that, but how many people are probably not? And it's just, it's so sad that this industry, sex workers, that it is such a dangerous industry to be in. But in my personal opinion, I feel as though the reason why someone like Gary Ridgway and someone like Richard Cottingham, they targeted sex workers is because they're an easy target. And the reason why I say that is because who's going to step forward and say that they're missing? Because they don't want to get in trouble. Their pimp's not going to go to the police and say, well, one of my employees is missing. No. Because that would ruin his entire operation. None of the friends are going to come forward because, oh, well, how do you know her? From work. Where do you work? They don't want to get in trouble either. And it's very common for sex workers to go missing. It's very common for them to get in the wrong car, be at the wrong place at the wrong time. It's a very common thing, unfortunately. As sad as it is for me to say that, and I think that that's why they targeted these sex workers, besides their own personal opinion about sex workers and whatever their opinion is of these women, they don't see them as human beings. They see them as just a body, just a victim. And who's going to miss them? That's how I look at it from an outsider's perspective. Again, I'm not an expert. This is just my opinion. But anyway, let's keep going because we're going to go over victim number 1. His first known victim, they did not link him to this case until much, much later. But because I want to follow the timeline, we're going to follow the timeline. When he was just 21 years old, he confessed that he murdered his first victim at just 21 years old. He would not confess this until August of 2010. So, when he was 21, August of 2010, that's a big time gap. But his first victim was Nancy Vogel, and she was killed in 1967. Nancy was a 29-year-old married mother of 2. And what I found was that apparently Richard and Nancy knew each other. They were both Little Ferry residents, Little Ferry, New Jersey. They were both residents of that area. But they had found her body in her car. She was strangled and she was nude, along with her body was bound. The last time that she had been seen was 3 days before they found her body, when she went to go play bingo with her friends at church. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. I forgot to add 3 more victims into the timeline. I did talk about them a little bit later, but because we're going through the timeline, I wanted to talk about them real quick because there were 3 teenagers that he had confessed to in 2020. And the first one was Jacqueline Harp. And on July 17th of 1968, she was in Midland Park and she was walking home from band practice when Cunningham tried to coax her into his car. I'm reading this off of an article that I just didn't go over in the video. And she was 13 years old at the time. He drove his car ahead of Harp, pulled over, and walked back towards her. And even though she ran, Cunningham overtook her and dragged her into some bushes where teens would, most of the time, they would go out there to smoke and, make out, kind of like a lover's lane kind of a deal. And she was found strangled to death by the next day. The next one was Irene Blaze, and she was 18 years old. And on April 7th of 1969, Cunningham, he saw her shopping in Hackensack, and she was somehow persuaded by him to go have a drink. And she was taking a bus to another location, but they decided to spend some time together, and after they were drinking, he offered to bring her back to the bus station, but she was found strangled to death the next day in 4 feet of water in the Saddle River. The next teen was Denise Velasca. I'm not sure if I'm saying that properly, but she was walking on the side of the road in Emerson on July 14th of 1969 when he had pulled up beside her and offered her a ride. She was 15 years old, and she was unfortunately found strangled to death the next day in Saddlebrook. He did not admit to these murders until 2020, so that's why I just completely missed putting that in the timeline, but I did talk about it a little bit later, but I didn't talk about it in full detail. So this is the full detail that I have. But anyway, let's get back to the video. On December 16th of 1967, his next victim would be found. Her name was Mary Ann Carr. Mary Ann was a 26-year-old radiologist, and she was married, and her husband was the one that called the police worried about her because he had found out, he was out of town on a business trip, and he had found out that she completely missed, she had an appointment with her mother-in-law, and she completely missed that appointment. So I don't know if it was work related or if it was they were just meeting up to have coffee or dinner or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. That detail I could not find. But police went to her apartment. They didn't see any sign of forced entry. They didn't see any sign of a struggle. Nothing was broken. So they had no idea where this woman was. When police were investigating her mysterious disappearance, they asked a few neighbors, and the one neighbor came forward, and this neighbor had told investigators that he had seen Mary Ann with her husband because he saw a man in his rearview mirror saying that that was her husband. But what the neighbor didn't know is that the husband, he bared a very, very big resemblance to Richard Cottingham. They looked very similar. They were around the same age. They had the same haircut. They had a mustache. So they looked very similar. So a lot of investigators were thinking about this and thinking, well, maybe the husband's in on it, but he had a very, very strong alibi. He was out of town on work. Mary Ann's body would be found in between a parked van and a chain link fence in Little Ferry, New Jersey. She was found with her white nurse's uniform on, and her pants were cut to the point where I believe it was her left leg was exposed. It was said that Mary Ann had lacerations to her chest and feet. Her body showed signs of having been bound because she had ligature marks on her wrists and her ankles. On top of that as well, because of the ligature marks, they looked a little bit closer and they found that she had a residue of white adhesive tape around her mouth. And homicide investigators concluded that she had been abducted after work, taken to a hotel room, and tortured, and was repeatedly raped by her killer before being killed and dumped on the side of this building. The third known victim of Richard Cottingham would be a survivor, and it's good that there were survivors because they were able to build a strong case against Richard. But this third known victim, her name was Karen Schultz. On March 22nd of 1978, she was waitressing at a restaurant in Manhattan. Now remember, Richard, even though he resided in New Jersey, he worked in the city. So she had been working at this restaurant. Karen took a break at around 6 p.m. and she decided to visit her boyfriend at a nearby hospital. When she came back after her break, and she worked to up until 8 p.m. She decided to have a few beers at the bar, and even though she was pregnant, while she was at the bar, she met a gentleman by the name of Joseph Schaefer, which was one of Richard's aliases, one of quite a number of them. He asked Karen if she was a working girl, meaning, is she a sex worker? She said no, but Richard kept asking because I don't know if maybe she looked like one or what the case may be, but he kept asking her over and over again. When Karen was questioned by police later on, it was said that she told them he looked like any other average guy in the city. He was in his 30s. He basically looked like any other guy in the city. So she would go on to say that she was attempting to go back to her apartment. While she was attempting to go back to her apartment, she noticed that she was starting to get kind of dizzy and kind of nauseous feeling. She felt like something was off. She would end up finding out later on that Richard, or Joseph, he put something in her drink. He spiked her drink, and that's what was making her feel like she was dizzy and just in and out, that kind of a thing. Joseph had offered Karen a ride back to her apartment. Karen agreed because she thought he was bringing her back to her apartment. All of a sudden, she came to, and she noticed that they were driving on Route 80 in New Jersey. So she was kind of confused, and Joseph gave Karen some kind of a pill, which was a depressant that was supposed to do something to the central nervous system. Obviously, she didn't know that this was going on. Karen would fall back asleep, and she woke up in Hackensack Hospital. She didn't know, it was weird. She didn't know what had happened, but she had been found lying still in a parking lot with her breasts and her genitals completely exposed to the world. There was a patrolman from the Little Ferry Police Department who saw her laying there and brought her to the hospital because you would hope that they would bring her to the hospital. She did survive. She was one of his survivors. But let's get on to victim number 4. Her name was Susanna Geiger. She was also a sex worker. That was her source of income. On October 10th of 1978, a man had approached her on the street, which this was obviously very common. This was part of her job. Susan told the man that she was busy for the rest of the night. She was completely booked up for the rest of the night, but she gave him her phone number to the hotel that she was staying at, and she said, if you are still looking for something, maybe tomorrow or something, just give me a call. The next night, on October 11th of 1978, is when this man would end up calling Susan and asking her if she was available that night. Susan would say yes. She would go on to tell investigators, because she is also another survivor of Richard Cottingham, she would go on to tell investigators that he went by the name Jim, which was another one of Richard's aliases. But she was picked up that night, and she said that when she was picked up by Jim, he did the same thing that Gary Ridgway did. He showed her pictures of his family, of his kids. So this is a way for them to build trust with their victims, in order for them to say, well, what could this guy possibly do? Because he's a loving family guy. He's just looking to have a little date tonight. So that's something that Gary Ridgway did as well. Jim and Susan would go to a local bar and they would have a couple of drinks. He would be buying drinks for Susan. Of course, again, he spiked one of Susan's drinks. This was kind of what he did. And she would all of a sudden wake up in a strange hotel room covered in her own blood. She had no idea what had happened. She was left in room 28 at the airport motel in South Hackensack, New Jersey. Susan had been tortured. She also had wounds to her face, breast, vagina, and rectum. And she remembered that Jim had hit her several times. She couldn't really remember much, but she did remember him hitting her 7 times. And he had ripped her gold earrings out of her ears because he did, as you will find out later on, but you're going to find out now, he did have a trophy room. So this is something else that a lot of these serial killers or murderers do. They like to have trophies because they like to relive that particular killing or that night or something. They just want to relive that. And there was a police officer who ended up taking her to the hospital. They searched this room for any kind of evidence. However, unfortunately, they couldn't find anything besides they found semen, and they were able to determine that the perpetrator had type O blood. So that was something that they kept on record, but that was the only evidence that they could possibly find at the scene. The next 2 victims are DeeDee Godarzi and a Jane Doe. They were never able to identify the other body. This is where it gets incredibly graphic, and I do not recommend, if you have a weak stomach, do not look up the crime scene photos because they are available online. They're even in some videos here on YouTube, and I was not expecting them to be in the video. So I don't recommend looking up the crime scene photos if you are not prepared to see what I'm about to talk about. But DeeDee came to the US from Kuwait. She was an immigrant. She was 14 when they came over, and when she was 18 years old, she decided to run away from her home and decided to become a sex worker in the city. DeeDee had given birth at some point in between her becoming a sex worker and before she was very brutally murdered. And this is important to remember for later on for something that we are going to be going over, but she gave her child up for adoption. There was a hotel called the Travel Inn, and on December 2nd of 1979 at about 9 o'clock in the morning, employees at the hotel ended up calling the local police department because they reported that there was heavy smoke coming out of the one room, which was room 417. After the fire department also came, but after the firefighters went into the room to put out the fire, they noticed that there were 2 female bodies on each bed. There was one on each bed. And one of the firefighters had grabbed one of the victims in order to take her out of the room and in order to be able to resuscitate her. However, when he took her out of the room, and I'm going to quote this, "I carried her out the door and put her down on the hall floor. I was preparing to give mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which is standard procedure, when I suddenly noticed there was no head." Both of the victims were nude. They were brutally tortured prior to being killed, and their bodies had been set on fire after their hands and heads had been chopped off. And the reason why Richard would end up in the future saying why he did this, and he did it so that they wouldn't be able to identify the victims. And the one victim was never identified. They were able to identify DeeDee, but they were not able to identify the other victim. Their skulls have to this day not been found. When they finally performed the autopsy, the results came back and said that both women had been tortured and sexually assaulted while they were still alive. So that was the turning point of this case when it got a little severe for me, and I decided to take a little bit of a break from researching it because like I said, I accidentally came across the crime scene photos, and I just could not wrap my head around the fact that a human being, a man, could do something like that to another human being. To me, it was just, I don't know. I couldn't believe it. But anyway, moving on to the next victim. The next victim would be Valerie Ann Street. She was 19 years old, and she was already working as a sex worker at this point in time. On April 30th of 1980, she left Florida for New York City. Just 4 days after arriving in the city, she was picked up by a man, and they were going on a date. Valerie had been driven to a motel that was located along Route 17 in New Jersey. Do you remember Ann Carr from the beginning, the woman who went missing, and they found her right near her apartment? Her husband had called because she missed an appointment with her mother-in-law. Valerie was found in the same location. Valerie had checked into room 132, and on May 5th, there was an employee who was going around and cleaning all of the rooms. When the employee had walked into the room, she noticed this really foul smell, and so she picked up the mattress and saw Valerie Ann Street's body underneath the mattress. She said that she had handcuffs on her. Investigators would also go on to say that Valerie had been gagged because she had white adhesive tape around her, and she had 2 ligature marks on her throat as well. Investigators would also find lacerations on Valerie's nipples, and when the autopsy was completed, it was determined that her killer had strangled her and then struck her lifeless body multiple times with a blunt object. On May 12th, 1980, just a week after Valerie's body was found, another sex worker, Pamela White, I'm not sure if I'm saying that properly, was found beaten up in a parking lot in Teaneck, New Jersey. Both police and hospital reports, they said that Pamela's attacker had bitten her several times, and she had been drugged before or after meeting Richard in New York or New Jersey. I couldn't find which one it was, but she was brutally beaten and had several wounds all over her body. Thankfully, Pamela was a survivor of Richard. During May of 1980, there was yet another victim found. Her name was Jean Reiner. Between the murder of Valerie and the discovery of Pamela, law enforcement found out that there was a 25-year-old sex worker named Jean Reiner in New York City. Her body had been found at a hotel. This time, Richard decided to change things up just a little bit. One of the interviews that he did with someone from, I believe she was from Canada, he had talked about, because she had asked him in this interview, why did you switch things up what was the reasoning for doing what you did, which I'll go over in a second. And he just wanted to switch things up. That's literally all that he wanted to do. He just wanted to switch things up a little bit. But he had removed both of her breasts and slit her throat. The detached breast would be found on the headboard of the bed in that particular room. And he tried to dispose of the evidence by lighting her body on fire, just like he had done to DeeDee and the Jane Doe from earlier. Firefighters were able to retrieve Jean's body, and the autopsy found that she had been stabbed to death instead of strangled this time around. So, it honestly, let's keep going. The next victim would be Richard's final victim. On May 21st of 1980, Richard took an 18-year-old sex worker named Leslie Odell and she was also a runaway, but he took her to the same motel where Valerie Street had been raped and murdered in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. Leslie was picked up by Richard in Manhattan. There were reports of screaming and yelling coming from the room, and Leslie had been tortured for hours. Employees had called law enforcement and told them there's just screaming going on, and they were still kind of spooked from what had happened there previously. So they called law enforcement, and police had come into the hotel at 9:30 a.m. on May 22nd of 1980. They knocked on the door and they had asked Leslie if she was okay. She said that everything was fine, but they would say in one of the documentaries that her face said otherwise, her eyes said otherwise, that something was not okay. So they decided to intervene. Richard had tried to run down through the hallways of the hotel or motel, and he was caught by police. Richard was 33 years old when he was arrested, and he denied what he had done. Even though he was caught red-handed, he denied what he had done. The charges that were listed under Richard's indictment in New Jersey, I'm going to read it off the screen, but they included kidnapping, attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated sexual assault while armed, possession of a weapon, possession of controlled dangerous substances. That's a lot of charges. There was one interview that I had watched, and I believe it was the one documentary. I'll leave all this link below, but I was watching it, and they said that there was at one point during the trial, Richard had tried to escape, and he tried to run away, but they were able to catch him. Like I said before, he would deny the things that he did, even though he was caught red-handed. Even though they had proof, he denied it. And the thing that he said was, this is the only thing that he would say, quote, "I have a problem with women," end quote. However, thanks to the surviving victims, they were able to build a strong case against Richard. In May of 1981, Richard Cottingham was convicted of 15 felony counts related to the murder of Valerie Street, which would end in a sentence of 173 to 197 years in prison. A year later, in 1982, a conviction on second-degree murder charges in the death of Ann Carr added another sentence of 20 years to life. In 1984, he was convicted on 3 counts of second-degree murder involving the Times Square sex workers. Richard Cottingham earned a sentence of 75 years to life. During his proceedings, he attempted to take his life 2 times. He was convicted of 5 murders. He confessed to Nancy Vogel's murder later on, and in 2020, he confessed to 3 more murders. They would also discover that he did have a trophy room in his home. Him and his family resided in New Jersey, and in the same home that he lived with his wife and his 3 kids, he had his trophy room. It was also said that approximately about a month before he was arrested, his wife had filed for divorce for what she said was extreme cruelty. His wife had also claimed that he had refused sex with her since 1976. Now remember, he was arrested in 1980. The next portion that I'm going to go over is what Ready to Glare had covered. There was an article that came out about DeeDee's daughter. Do you remember how I talked about how DeeDee had a child and she gave her up for adoption? Well, Jennifer Weiss was her biological daughter. Jennifer Weiss does live in New Jersey. And before we proceed with the article, I need to reiterate what happened to her mother, her biological mother. DeeDee Godarzi was tortured, and she was decapitated, and her hands were chopped off, and she was lit on fire. Her skull has never been found. So when I was reading this article, I can understand where Jennifer is coming from that she's saying how she's trying to befriend Richard so that she can get answers for the victims' families and that she can get answers for herself. However, there are certain things that she says, both in an interview with NJ.com, which is on YouTube, and both in this article that I'm going to go over, that are a little alarming, and in my personal opinion, I feel are crossing that line from doing this as a strategy to maybe even becoming friends with him. Personally, if someone did that to my mother, I would not forgive them. I would not forget any of it. I would not befriend them. I don't even think I would visit them in prison, honestly. I don't even think that I would do that. Even if my mother's remains were not found, I do not think that I could face my mother's killer. that's just my personal opinion. So, and I'm not trying to pass any judgment on this woman. I'm sure that she's able to find, I'm sure that she's been able to find some answers, but I feel as though certain things that she has said have kind of crossed that line a little bit. But let's go over this article, because Jennifer had been looking for her biological mom because she knew that she was adopted. So she went to the facility that she was adopted from and asked them if they could provide her with some kind of documentation showing who her biological mother was. They would end up telling her, "I'm really sorry, but your mother was murdered." And they told her exactly what had happened. But let's get into this article. I'm going to pop it up on the screen along with read a little bit from it. But the title of the article says, "Woman befriends the serial killer who murdered her mother, says he's now, quote, like a father," end quote. Jennifer Weiss's unlikely friendship with Richard Cottingham, also known as the Torso Killer, has helped her learn more about her mother and may even bring closure to the families of other victims. Could you forgive someone if they killed your mother? Could you befriend them? One New Jersey woman has done just that and now even considers her mom's killer to be something of a father figure. This is where I said that I think it's crossing a line. As odd as that may sound, her relationship with the man has yielded some practical benefits. She views it as a way to learn about her mother and to help bring a sense of closure and justice to the families of other victims. Jennifer Weiss's mom, DeeDee Godarzi, was found dead alongside another unidentified woman in a Times Square motel room in 1979. The 22-year-old's death appeared brutal. She had been beheaded and set on fire, and her skull is yet to be found. Her killer, Richard Cottingham, was a computer operator, married with 3 children of his own, living a seemingly normal life, but beneath the veneer of normalcy was a heinous double existence as a serial killer. Known as the Torso Killer due to his habit of dismembering his later victims, he also chopped off the hands of his victims in order to mask their identities and skirt criminal charges, according to the Bergen Record. Cunningham was arrested for a string of deaths in the early 1980s. His 1984 conviction for Godarzi's slaying was one of 6 in New York and New Jersey, though he allegedly claimed to have killed up to 100. Earlier this year, he confessed to killing 3 teen girls by strangulation between 1968 and 1969, Bergen County prosecutor Mark Masulas told NJ.com. Despite the horrific crimes he committed, Weiss told Oxygen.com that she now visits Cunningham in prison a few times a month. In fact, she's visited him more than 30 times now and thinks of him like a father. As many daughters do with their boomer relatives, she helps him figure out how to use his iPad. In a picture of the pair, Weiss mimics strangling him, ironic because that was his MO for killing his victims. It's truly an unlikely pair. Weiss said she also felt inclined to meet Cunningham ever since she found out her mother was one of his victims in 2002. "I also knew I was going to befriend him for information," she told Oxygen.com. "That's something I knew even when I didn't know if I was going to approach him. But before meeting him, she knew she had to prepare herself first. Quote, in order to do this, I had to build up actual forgiveness and love," end quote. She said, adding that, quote, "could have gone there with anger and had many ways to thrash him, but decided to take a different route. What meant more was that this is a human being," she said. "I had to go there with love and respect, and I had to respect this whole man because he was put on this planet to do all these tragic things." Before actually meeting Cunningham, she began writing to him. I wrote to him and said, "You're going to be blown away by me, and I'm going to make you cry." She said, "Your friends are going to be so jealous when they see me come and visit you. I'm so cool and I'm so kind. You should be honored to have someone like me as a friend." Cottingham told Weiss that he had known her mother for a few years. And while she said Cottingham told her it's possible but not probable that he's her father, they have not yet taken any paternity test. Related by blood or not, Weiss told Oxygen.com that she cares about him like family and I treat him like a daughter would. Jennifer's approach to Cunningham with forgiveness and friendship has made it easier for him to confess to other murders, serial killer expert and author Peter Vronsky told Oxygen.com, which I hope that that is the case, and I do hope that somehow this is getting some kind of closure for some of the victims' families. But let's keep going with this article because some of the things that are said, anyway. "I'd love to sort through the mess he made," she said. "It's like, come on, Dad, we gotta pick up these pieces because he's so old. Sometimes when I talk to him, I'll say while snapping her fingers, 'Hey, Pops,' to bring him back to let's do this for humanity because he has no desire to do anything for humanity." So their friendship, while non-traditional and perhaps morbid, could be beneficial for many in the long run. Quote, "He doesn't want to do it, but he did promise he'd do it for me." End quote, Weiss told Oxygen.com. My thoughts on this is I get why she's doing this because she's showing him friendship. She's showing him this positive side of humanity. And she's trying to get answers for both finding where her mother's skull is, finding out more about her mother and her mother's life, but she's also trying to get him to confess to get some kind of closure for the other victims' families. So I understand why she's doing this. However, I think that she's a little too friendly. This is just my personal opinion, and I'm not trying to pass judgment on her or anything like that. Me personally, I think that she crossed a little bit of a line when she said things like daughter and father and dad and pops. That kind of irks me a little bit because I feel as though because she asked him, "Could you possibly be my dad?" I think that, personal opinion, again, I'm not an expert, that she's almost hoping that he is her dad so that she could end this constant, I guess you can say, just this constant investigating of trying to find her dad. So I think in a sense she's hoping that it's him because she can end this looking for her dad. But at the same time, I think she also doesn't want him to be her dad because he is a serial killer. Now, again, I can't speak for her. I have never talked to her before. I don't know anything about her besides this. But I hope that what she's doing does get some kind of closure for the families and for the victims' families. Personally, I do think she crossed a line. I do think she crossed the line and she is getting way too close and way too friendly with him. And I hope that that doesn't skew her mission of what she's trying to do here, that she's trying to get answers and that she's trying to get him to confess. That's just me personally, but again, I'm not an expert. But my final thoughts on this entire case. Honestly, I think it is one of the worst cases I have looked into thus far on my channel. I know that the Green River Killer was a really bad one, but this one is right up there. It's right up there. Every case is very terrible and very horrible and just disgusting and heinous because I cannot see how someone could do something like this to another human being. But I do think that this is one of the worst cases that I have covered on this channel just because of what he did to some of his victims. I mean, they were all raped and tortured, but the fact that he decapitated people, he chopped their hands off. And there was one interview where he talked about how, because someone asked him, well, what did you do with the heads and the hands? Like, how did you leave the hotel room like that? And he said, well, they didn't think anything of it. I put it in my bag and I just walked out of the hotel room. I cannot wrap my head, I cannot wrap my head around this case. But the more that I look into cases that are this heinous, the more I lose faith in humanity. Because how can you do that to another human being? I understand there is a psychological part behind it as well. Not defending any of his actions, not trying to make up excuses for any of his actions. But I can't understand it. And I probably never will. I mean, I can read as many books on forensic psychology and all that kind of stuff. I can read as many books as I want on that topic, but I will never understand what makes a human being do that to another human being. That's just my personal take on it. And I also, the whole article that I just spoke about the daughter and DeeDee Goodarzi, that shocked me. It did. It shocked me a lot. But before I end this video, I did want to take a moment of silence for all of the victims that both he was convicted of and the victims that he has confessed to, and along with some victims that he claimed were his victims, but he was never convicted for. So let's take a moment of silence for those victims. All right, everyone, if you have watched up to here, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Have you heard of this case? What do you think of this case? What do you think of DeeDee Goodarzi's daughter befriending Richard Cottingham? And just let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll leave everything linked, both all of the documentaries that I talked about, if I remember, because there's a few that I don't remember if I saved them or not, but I'll leave all of that link below, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.